So I think we're going to move on to our next session now, which is on countering data exploitation. We've got Ailidh Krasodomski-Jones from Demos, and we've got Ailidh Callander from Privacy International. This is going to be an in-conversation style event between Alex and Ailidh. And yeah, I think we'll just begin now.
Sorry, I sat on the microphone. It's being painful. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Alex. I am director of the Centre for Analysis of Social Media at Demos. And we've spent the last 6 or 7 years working with government and with decision makers to think about the ways in which technology changes our culture, our society, our communities, our politics, and so on. And it feels like, at least in my world, and no doubt yours as well, that the last 12 months have seen a real shift in the debate and the conversations around the collection and use of personal data, from Cambridge Analytica to Facebook, elections here and abroad, referenda. The way our digital footprint can be used to track us, sell to us, and even influence us politically has been headline news. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Ailidh Callander, legal officer at Privacy International, where Ailidh is responsible for legal advocacy, legal research on data protection and privacy. Now, I have a ton of questions, but I will try to restrain myself, and we will talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then I will open it up to the audience. Hello.
Hi, thank you also for having me here today. Thanks, Alex.
So am I right in thinking that this sense that I have that the public conversation around data privacy and data protection and its use by governments and by companies has really moved on in the last 12 months? Is that something a sense that you share?
I think so, to an extent. These issues that Privacy International, as an NGO, working to fight for the right to privacy and counter both corporate and state surveillance and data exploitation, have been working on for a while. But I really think with GDPR taking effect in the EU this year, and then reactions to particularly the way data is used in elections, there has been it's been a bit of a wake-up call. I think for regulators and for governments, and then it's also whether it was the multiple GDPR emails, but there has been more of an awareness of data protection law, which is something we've had for over 20 years in the UK, but actually, what does this mean? People kind of getting a bit more to grips with the rights that they have. And I think it is really just the beginning in this kind of sphere. I mean, for example, in 2013, in terms of surveillance, I think the Snowden revelations were a big moment. And then I do think that the reporting and then the kind of fallout from Cambridge Analytica has been a big thing. I think it's also important to kind of look back on that and think, well, it's not really just about one company. It's a much bigger and more systemic question about how our data is used in day-to-day, and what is the online behavioral advertising system, how is data used in elections, and these are just many questions. And as more and more data is generated about us as we go about our day-to-day lives, there's going to be more questions, and we need to think about more solutions, and I think often taking that step back to try and to not just act without thinking about it.
What was, I think, interesting about the coverage of the Cambridge Analytica sort of scandal as it turned out was that actually a lot of the scandal was around the behavior of some of the people who worked there, the methods that they claimed they used, and actually perhaps that distracted a little bit from the core message, which was around the exploitation and the profiling of people through their data. This Cambridge Analytica is just the tip of the iceberg here. Is that fair?
Definitely, and I think you can see that slightly in the fallout. And it's not just about the UK and elections in the UK. For example, we worked with partners in Kenya previously to look at the way data was used in the Kenyan elections. And then, for example, when you look back at the first reporting around Cambridge Analytica, one of the first announcements by Facebook was that they were going to stop some of their partnerships with data providers. So, for example, Axiom, Experian, and Oracle provide data to Facebook. And that kind of leads on to a big question about all the companies that use our data that we maybe aren't so aware of, that we have no direct relationship with, but actually amass vast amounts of data about us.
So yesterday, when I was going to cook dinner, I looked up a recipe. And I feel that this happens time and again on it, specifically with regards to recipes, where you log on to a website for how to make a pasta dish, and you hit the GDPR. Yes, no, accept. And if you click through, you see hundreds and hundreds of companies who I've never heard of who are partners with this website in terms of data sharing. How big a phenomenon are we talking about here?
So, I mean, that's in a way one of the recent consent management solutions that's been kind of available since GDPR came into effect. I've got various issues with it, but in that sense, you maybe kind of scroll and you see, 200 companies, and that's really just, as you say, the tip of the iceberg. It's just some of the companies. And in terms of, from a legal perspective, this is covering both data protection law, but also e-privacy as well. And it is, it's about tracking and profiling and being able to build up a more intricate insight into individuals and how they go about their day-to-day lives, both online and offline and across multiple devices as well.
You mentioned that perhaps you had some complaints about this quote-unquote consent management, this accept, this non-accept. Do you see these pop-ups as being GDPR compliant or indeed more widely compliant?
So we recently submitted complaints, and this is one of the issues that we raised. On one hand, banners and pop-ups are a result of regulation, and they are a way, the intention is at least to provide more transparency, to alert individuals to the way their data is being used. But one of the big things that GDPR was about was really enhancing the definition of consent, what consent means, and trying to make it more meaningful. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, when you look at this as they pop up around, often the default settings for these pop-ups, even the ones with the more detailed list of 200 companies that your data is shared with, the default settings means that you often still have to go in and reject all if they even decide to include the reject all button. Mm-hmm. And even if you know, right, okay, the reality is people want to access the site, you want to make your pasta.
Too right.
And what does that even mean? It's just another company on one of many companies.
Yep.
So I think that it's something that more thought needs to go into. And there are issues around this kind of global consent that can you really just click yes then, and that just replicates throughout the ecosystem.
So you mentioned that was one of your complaints. Now, my understanding is that Privacy International has issued complaints to the ICO with regards to 7 companies. Can you talk a little bit more about why you did that and the process of doing it?
Yeah, so, well, as you all know and have just been talking about, GDPR took effect this year in May. And, we really see that just as the beginning. In theory, GDPR should place more stringent obligations on companies, strengthen the rights of individuals, and kind of change a bit this kind of the power imbalance. But in practice, I think the real test of GDPR will be not just the implementation, but the enforcement. But it is really just the beginning. We're like 6 months on almost since it took effect. So what we wanted to do here was also place more scrutiny on these companies that aren't necessarily consumer-facing. We've heard a lot about Facebook this year, rightly. There's been scandal after scandal. We hear about Google, and we should probably hear more about Google. But there are big companies that have vast amounts of data that we don't hear about every day. And there have been reports in the past. The FTC in the US looked into data brokers. Civil society such as the Open Society Foundation and various other organizations have flagged them, and they have been flagged in work by regulators such as the ICO, but yet they continue to operate. And the business model of certain data brokers and some of the ad tech companies really is, in a way, the antithesis of what GDPR is about, in a way, because their very purpose is to amass vast amounts of data and repurpose it, which goes against the very principles of data protection. So we wanted to kind of focus scrutiny on some of these companies and call on regulators, now that they have these teeth, to consider using these teeth against these companies. So we submitted 7 complaints against 7 companies that are illustrative of the problems that we see. So against Axiom, which is a big consumer-facing, consumer marketing data broker, present in the UK but also elsewhere. Oracle, which has various facets to its business model as well. Then 2 credit reference agencies, Equifax and Experian. And then 3 ad tech companies. Quantcast, which is actually one of the ones responsible for a lot of these pop-ups that you'll see as you browse the internet. Criteo, which is a French company, and Tapad, which is owned by Telenor, the Norwegian big tele company, but specializes in cross-device tracking. So these complaints raised various issues, and what we found across the board with these companies were that these companies were falling short, but both in terms of having a legal basis for what they do, and also in terms of the principles in data protection law, both in terms of transparency, fairness, accuracy, purpose limitation, data minimization. All of these principles raised issues. And then there are the challenges in terms of individuals actually exercising their rights against these companies. And these companies are just illustrative of wider problems in these industries. So what we were doing there was, when we sent them to the UK ICO, to the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, and also to CNIL in France, we're calling on them to investigate, but also to look into the wider industry. And actually in the UK, the ICO has already, so we're wanting to add to some of the work they'd already been doing on data brokers and credit reference agencies. So they've issued assessment notices against Equifax and Experian, and they've also they've also announced their intent to issue one against Axiom as well. So I think it's something that we're starting to see looked into more. There've been other complaints around behavioural advertising as well. There was a complaint in September to the UK ICO and also to the Irish Data Protection Commissioner against the behavioural advertising system more generally, and looking specifically at the Interactive Advertising Bureau and the consent and transparency framework.
So there seems to be some consensus between both, the complaints that you've made and also investigative work by the OCO. What's the response from the companies themselves been, or has there been none at all?
So there's been limited response, but I think it really is just the beginning, and it does ask some bigger and wider questions. But I think it is interesting when you look at the ICO reports from this year. There was the 2 investigation reports and also the report Democracy Disrupted. And these are talking about data and political campaigning, but they do flag the role of data brokers and the online behavioural advertising system and the way that this can be used for political purposes, for example. So that has, I think, been part of the wake-up call, and that's where we get to these bigger questions of, are we happy with the way things are going here? And really, if you look at it, it seems to really fall short of what GDPR requires.
So this data isn't just being used to sell us stuff?
Well, I think that's where it needs further investigation. So it's already been clear that various data brokers have partnership with political parties. There's also evidence of the public sector using data brokers. So, for example, Big Brother Watch, another entity, they did reporting, and then you can see from looking at public contracts that police use data brokers like Experian and to feed into, for example, risk assessment tools. So there is that wider question of how is the data being used, and it is questions of kind of profiling and ever more kind of granularity, but also this kind of, it's very hard to escape, when it's ever more targeted across devices as well.
Is the problem here a problem that requires further legislation to deal with, or is it actually applying GDPR, more in the spirit, to the letter and also in the spirit of the legislation itself?
I think that GDPR is a good start, and data protection law in itself is a good start. It's not the solution by any means, but I think in terms of looking at how to counter problems, look at the tools that we already have, and data protection is one of them. And GDPR, even though it was drafted a number of years ago now, is still only just taken effect. So I think that it will require time, like all laws, to first it needs to be implemented, then it needs to be enforced, and there will be discussion around the meaning of certain terms that it will need jurisprudence from the courts, but I think it's an important place to start. And I think you can see recognition that data protection is one important tool. Around the world, there's now over 120 data protection laws, and this year there's bills in India. Brazil just passed a law without a supervisory authority. There's a bill in Pakistan, in Kenya, in Indonesia, and the US as well now is discussing more comprehensive privacy legislation. So it is one tool, and I think that we need to use it to the extent that we can, and both implement it in industry, understand it as a civil society, and use it, educate individuals as well as to their rights, and it does require that implementation and then that enforcement to push the implementation, because some parts of it are not new. They were already the law before, but it wasn't being implemented. And I do think it's the beginning, but I also think it requires a multidisciplinary approach. As a lawyer, too often the law is left to lawyers, and it's very, it doesn't translate well necessarily into practice, and often that's the case with privacy policies, for example. And I think it requires more people to have a good understanding of what it means, and then you'll come up with better ideas of how to implement it in a way that's actually effective and meaningful.
That's really interesting. So I think that there's that sort of there's that contradiction, I suppose, in some ways, where on the one hand we have seen a huge growth in the sort of public awareness of data privacy, but really when you start digging into the solutions for this kind of thing, it's labyrinthine. It's very, very difficult to understand. What more could the public do? Or what should government and others and civil society do to help people protect themselves? Is that something that you guys have looked at?
So I don't think that the onus or the burden should be on the individual. Mm-hmm. It should primarily be on whoever's got the data, whoever's controlling the data, and that's really where, and I think that the law does do that. It puts this accountability burden on those that choose to process data. So it is kind of multifaceted in the sense you have, so if you take the law, it then needs to be implemented in a way that makes it a reality. So what is data protection by design and by default in practice? How is that being implemented in practice in a way that is actually meaningful? And then also people's rights, how people made aware of their rights, and how do we facilitate people using their rights as well? So I think that regulators have a role there, but everyone, whether it's a company or a public authority, has a role to play. And I think another thing which is important is kind of collective redress as well, and the ability for civil society, for example, to take actions when there is a problem, when people's data is being exploited. And in that sense, it was disappointing in the UK with the passing of the UK data protection bill. There was an optional clause in GDPR which provided that NGOs could take cases. Mm-hmm. And this derogation was not implemented in the UK. It was implemented in certain countries, but in the UK there's just been a commitment to review it in 30 months from the passing of the bill. So I think that's something in the UK, at least, it's important to look to, because often, if we talk about GDPR needing time, if we talk about the need for court cases, well, who's going to bring the cases? The burden really shouldn't be on an individual, because often the systemic problems, and I think you can see it a bit with the data and election work, is it's very hard to know that it's impacting you as an individual, and then what do you do about it? And so I think that's something that needs more work. And then in terms of individuals' rights, there has been, I think it was just mentioned, the ICO did have its kind of Your Data Matters campaign to try and make its resources a bit more accessible to individuals, and they have some templates. But in terms of civil society, there's been certain tools developed. The Open Rights Group in the UK, they've developed a tool with Designs by IV, a design company, to try and make it easier for people to exercise their rights. And in different countries, like in the Netherlands, there's been one, and there's also a guy in Switzerland that also has an access tool to try and kind of facilitate that. And actually, as part of these complaints that I mentioned, in tandem with that, we sought to make it slightly easier for individuals to ask these companies to delete their data on the basis that, I mean, if you don't think this company should have your data in the first place, it should at least be easy for you to ask them to delete it. And I think that certain companies probably have made an effort in the way that they facilitate individuals accessing their rights, but it is a long way to go. And particularly for bigger companies, there's just no excuse. I mean, yes, Facebook, for example, has download your data tool, but I mean, is that really all of your data?
Sure. And also, I've downloaded my data, and even as a sort of quasi data scientist, it's hard work trying to process that. And is that really everything they have? I mean,
and what about if you don't even have a Facebook account?
Well, quite exactly. I do think this is super important. We last year or the year before, we commissioned a load of polling and did a load of focus group work in the UK and in around Europe, looking precisely at the subject of fear and what was driving fear, particularly when it came to political solutions to that fear. We've seen over the past 3 or 4 years the rise of this sort of so-called populist movement in Europe, and we went there with a pretty open mind, but we were surprised as to how much of this fear that communities around Europe felt was rooted in tech, and specifically a sense of alienation from technology, a sense that they didn't really have any idea how, as individuals, they were supposed to interact with the government through technology, with the tech companies themselves, how they were supposed to achieve any kind of redress for things that went wrong as a result of services that they were using. It feels like we have an awful long way to go in trying to bring the most sort of digitally vulnerable people in this country and in the world more generally along with us with this kind of legislation.
I mean, I think when you talk about the intersection between human rights and technology, it's really important to have this joined up approach in a sense. It shouldn't be just the data protection regulator, the ICO, looking at this. There's much bigger questions, and I think they've sought to work with the Electoral Commission on some of these issues. But it's wider, and I think that you can see that at EU level now as well. The certain regulators calling to work with other regulators, whether that's consumer protection, for example, and you can see that with consumer protection organisations as well, becoming much stronger in the digital sphere. And I think as well, it's not just consumer protection. It's not just about the right to privacy. It's about all of our civil and political rights. It's about all of our economic, social, and cultural rights as well. So it's in part awareness. It's in part capacity, but it's about that kind of understanding and then trying to think of solutions as well.
Really good. Ailidh did remind me when I was coming to this that I should time keep, but then I sat on the microphone and completely forgot. So how long do we have remaining? Anyone know? Okay, let's say it's 15 minutes. 10 minutes, perfect. So thank you very much, Ailidh. Do we have any questions for Ailidh? Yes, over here. And if we, in the spirit of the tweet board behind me, if we could try to keep our questions to 140 characters.
1, 2, 3. Yeah, okay, I'm back. I will try to do my best in the same spirit, Alex.
That's already 140 characters.
First of all, great conversation. First of all, Khaled Fatal, MLI Group, for the record. A lot of what you're talking about, we're heavily not only involved in, but addressing in greater depth, but on an international scale. And I was hoping to try and give a bit of refocus to this, to give it greater value. the topic here is countering data exploitation. It sounds to me like fixing the wheel at the shopping cart at the local Sainsbury's store. What if we were to change the narrative so that the public, who, as you both were talking about, should recognize the value and the concern or the consequence of all this? Let's change the narrative.
Can we cut to a question? Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Thanks.
Here's the narrative. What if we were to say that democracy is under unprecedented threat? So for example, when we talk about Cambridge Analytica as an example, how many people in the audience know that Cambridge Analytica was directly involved in the direction of 2 African presidential elections? That's a threat to democracy. So I'll give that the context to you that perhaps the challenge to engaging the public about what really pertains to their welfare is to changing the narrative perhaps. And you can use the democracy under unprecedented threat because that's what we talk about as well. You have my permission.
Absolutely. 2 more questions, please. Yes.
Does Julian Coles, independent consultant, does GDPR adequately deal with AI, Internet of Things, and voice data?
Very good question. Ailidh, so maybe we can answer Julian's question first, and then we'll talk a little bit about data and democracy more broadly.
Yeah, no, that would be great. So it's a good question. I think that GDPR has tried to do this to an extent, and that there are many principles and provisions of data protection law that you can take over. I think when you're to AI, you then have to think about what it is specifically you're talking about with AI, but you have these the provisions around automated decision making, but they have various loopholes and gaps in them. And so I think that's where it's interesting as well to look at data protection laws that are post-GDPR. So, what has Brazil done? What will India do? Not include that provision, for example. But data protection is not necessarily the solution. It's something that offers some tools and can be taken into account. But I do think we need to think more broadly about that. In terms of IoT, data protection might address some of the data aspects of it, but you also need to think about cybersecurity legislation, think about product liability law, for example. And I think in terms of looking at existing legal frameworks, data protection is definitely not the only one. You can look at competition as well, for example. And data protection is very limited to personal data, and whatever the law defines as personal data at that time that the law is implemented in, that has expanded with the previous law, and I think that needs to be broad, but it doesn't necessarily offer solutions for kind of more group questions or where it's argued that the data isn't personal, and I think that those are questions that come out in those topics that you mentioned, and I think that voice data, biometric data. I mean, we need to kind of keep an eye on these things and not just be like, okay, yeah, we have GDPR, that's it. It's much more, how can we use what we've got, and then we need to keep thinking. I think, and then I think this is a very good point, and it's something that we do talk about, and I think, I mean, that was Cambridge Analytica in Nigeria. That's a huge, what happened there was I think a key part of the story, or working with kind of our partners in Kenya on that. So I think that, if you look at Brazil and the elections in Brazil just now, Coding Rights, which is one of our partners, just did a report on data in the elections in Brazil, and there is Experian again. They work in Brazil, there they are. So I completely agree. It's I think I use too many UK examples because we're in the UK, but it is a much bigger question. And I think that's where, when authorities are talking about these issues, they need to do so in a joined up way. And I think the ICO has taken quite a lead on this in the EU, but it's also, I was at the Data Protection Privacy Commissioners Conference in Brussels a few weeks ago, and it was really something that all data protection authorities were speaking about. But it's not just a data protection topic, and it is broader than that. And I think that it's something we need to continue to think about and break down as well, what the challenges are. And law is only ever as good as the rule of law, for example. If you're talking about law to hold to account, you need to think about having an independent authority to actually enforce the law, the courts to uphold the law as well.
Really interesting. Let's take another round of questions. Yes?
These ad tech companies, the ad tech companies for Privacy International, do you want to put them out of business, yes or no?
Okay, very good. And just to hear at the back.
Philip Virgo. Somewhere over 10 years ago, I signed up for an Experian service which I thought was going to help me police everybody else who was using my data on the internet. I would love to be able to give Experian exclusive rights to manage my data in line with what I want them to do and get everybody else to delete it. Is that a pie-in-the-sky aspiration? And who would you actually trust to manage your data?
Two really good questions. Let's start with Nick's. Is this the apocalypse for I suppose, the business model that underpins a huge part of the internet as we understand it?
Well, in the spirit of the question, because it was yes or no, I'll go with yes. But it is a more nuanced, I think, question than that. It's saying to the regulators, you need to look at this industry, because and that's very much what these complaints was what you say you do. It wasn't a technological investigation. It was based on subject access requests, analysis of their privacy policies, and analysis of the marketing materials. So this is what they say they do. And if you match it up against the law, they fall short. So they need to have a serious think about what it is they do. And actually, you had some companies withdrew their business from Europe, such as Drawbridge, which is one of the big cross-device ones. So I think it is a bigger question. But I do think that it really needs further scrutiny, not just looking at what they say they do, but actually what do they do. And in terms of the other question, so to clarify, the complaint we made against Experian was about their marketing services, in the sense that they offer a suite of services, and they have their role as credit reference agency, then they offer these kind of like fraud protection things, but this was really against their marketing, which, you might know Experian has your data because you've had to, check your credit score or something like that. But they need to be much clearer. Where does the line lie between what they do for those purposes and what they do for marketing purposes? For example, when we got data from Quantcast, the one that has the pop-ups you mentioned, you could see the Experian segments that you had been segmented into. Some of which we raise various issues with, because they are fairly derogatory, but they're also, they include references to ethnicity, for example, which is special category personal data. But yeah, and who would I trust my data with? It's a good question. I mean, the pie in the sky is that you should be able to trust your data with anyone if they comply with the law, but that's where there's also lots of loopholes and carve-outs.
Amazing. Guys, thank you so much for listening, and just a round of applause for Ailidh.
Thank you, Alex.